Picture this. You're at a dinner table. People are laughing. Someone just said something funny and glasses are clinking and the room is warm and loud and full of life. And you are sitting right there, in the middle of all of it, nodding and smiling and saying the right things at the right moments. And somewhere inside your chest, behind all of that, there is this quiet, persistent ache. Not sadness exactly. Not depression. Not even loneliness in the way most people use the word. It's something older than that. Something that doesn't respond to more friends, or better conversations, or busier weekends. It just sits there, underneath everything, like a frequency that never quite turns off. You've felt it your whole life. In crowds. In relationships. In your best moments sometimes. This strange sense of being somehow adjacent to your own life. Present, but not quite inside it. Connected, but separated by glass. And here is the thing that makes it so confusing. You cannot explain it. Because your life, by every visible measure, is fine. And so you do what most people do. You call it overthinking. You call it being tired. You chalk it up to personality. But what if I told you that feeling is not a personality trait? What if I told you it's a memory? And more specifically, what if the loneliness you feel as an adult today is the direct echo of something that happened to you as a child? Something that left no visible scar but rewired your brain so fundamentally that you have been living inside its consequences ever since, without ever knowing that's what was happening. That is not a metaphor. That is neuroscience. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how it works, why it feels the way it does, and most importantly, what it means for who you get to become from here. Stay with me. Because this one is going to reach something in you that most conversations never touch. So let's start with you. Specifically. Because before we get into any science or research, I want you to recognize yourself. I want you to feel seen before you feel informed. Because the people this video is really for, they are very good at receiving information and very practiced at keeping it at arm's length. And I don't want that to happen today. So here is a short portrait. See how much of it fits. You are the person people describe as strong. Not in a complimentary way, but in a quietly expectant way. Like it's your job. Like it's what you're for. And somewhere along the way you accepted that assignment, because it was easier than the alternative. You are deeply uncomfortable asking for help. Not because you think it's weak, at least not consciously, but because somewhere deep in your body, the act of reaching out and needing something from another person feels like standing at the edge of something dangerous. So you don't reach. You handle it yourself. Always. You watch other people be openly vulnerable with each other, crying in front of someone, saying, "I need you right now," falling apart without immediately trying to hold the pieces. And it looks almost foreign to you. Like watching someone speak a language you were never taught. You understand the words. You just can't make your mouth form them. And then there are those moments. The quiet ones. Late at night, usually, when the noise dies and there's nothing left to distract you. And it arrives. That feeling. The one we started this video with. That deep, inexplicable, structureless sense of being completely alone, even though your phone has messages in it, and there are people who would answer if you called. You know that feeling, don't you? Here is what nobody ever told you about that feeling. It is not yours. It doesn't belong to your present. It was handed to you a very long time ago by a room you were in before you had the words to describe what was happening inside it. And now it's time to go back to that room. Not to suffer there again, but to finally understand what it made. To do that, we need to understand one piece of science that changes everything. And I promise you, it is not complicated. It is just something you were never taught. Every human child is born with the full emotional range of the species. Fear, grief, rage, terror. All of it, fully online, from the very beginning. The feelings are completely real, completely intense, completely physiological. And yet the part of the brain that manages those feelings, the part that can put language to them, regulate them, turn the volume down, that part is not developed. Not even close. It won't be fully built until a person is somewhere in their mid-20s. Now think about what that actually means for a small child. Imagine being handed the most powerful stereo system ever built. It receives every signal, every frequency, full volume, all at once. Every emotional broadcast in the universe, coming through simultaneously. And you have no controls. No knobs, no dials, no off switch. You can only receive. You can only feel. You cannot manage what you're feeling at all. That is the lived experience of a young child in emotional distress. So how does a child survive that? How does the radio ever get turned down? There is only one way. Someone has to lend them the knobs. A parent who sees the distress, who walks toward it instead of away from it, who sits down and says, in words or simply in presence, "I see what you're feeling. It's real. I'm here. It's going to be okay." That act, that simple, repeated, consistent act of emotional witnessing, is not just love. It is neurological construction. Every single time it happens, the child's brain builds another fiber of its own internal regulation. Over years and thousands of repetitions, the child slowly builds their own knobs. They develop the internal architecture to eventually manage the signal themselves. But now ask yourself the critical question. What happens when nobody comes? What happens when the radio is screaming and the child looks up and there is nothing? Not cruelty, necessarily. Not abuse in the traditional sense. Just absence. A parent who is physically present but emotionally somewhere else. Lost in their own unprocessed grief, or their own survival, or their own childhood that nobody sat with either. A parent who, when the child was distressed, went quiet, or changed the subject, or said, "You're fine," in a tone that meant, "Please stop." The child cannot stop feeling. That is not possible. But the child can learn something. Something devastating and ingenious at the same time. They can learn that the signal is theirs alone. That the outside world will not come. That needing is not safe. That the only strategy that works, the only one that doesn't end in the particular agony of reaching and receiving nothing, is to stop reaching. And so, because brains do what brains are built to do, the system adapts. The circuitry for connection goes quiet. Not broken. Not gone. Quiet. Like a muscle that is never used. And the circuitry for self-containment, for managing alone, for existing without the need for anyone else's emotional presence, that circuitry gets built instead. Thick and strong, because it gets all the use. This is what researchers call use-dependent development. The systems that fire together, wire together. The brain that repeatedly activates around aloneness becomes, structurally, a brain that runs on aloneness by default. Not because something went wrong with that brain. Because something went profoundly right with it. It was surviving the only environment it had. Now here is the piece that I need you to hold for a second before we move forward. This did not happen because you were unlovable. It happened because the person who was supposed to hand you the knobs, for whatever reason, however understandable or inexcusable, didn't have their own knobs to give. And the child you were, faced with that impossible situation, did something extraordinary. They became their own knobs. They built, from nothing, an entire internal system of self-regulation. They became hypervigilant so they could anticipate trouble before it arrived. They became emotionally self-contained so they would never again be ambushed by the pain of an unanswered need. They became the strong one, the capable one, the one who handles it, because that role at least had the dignity of a function. Every adaptation you are still running today, every wall and every strategy and every way you've learned to need less and give more and keep people at a specific, manageable distance, all of it was, at one point, absolutely brilliant. It was the work of a remarkably resourceful child in an impossible situation. The hypervigilance that exhausts you now? It was once a survival radar that kept you safe in an unpredictable environment. The self-reliance that isolates you now? It was once the only available lifeline. The emotional distance that keeps people from fully knowing you? It was once the most intelligent boundary a child could draw. You did not fail to develop. You developed around a missing ingredient with such precision and such completeness that most people around you never even noticed the construction was happening. Which is why what comes next is so important. Because here is where the research goes somewhere that most people are completely unprepared for. The brain does not just wire for aloneness. It becomes fluent in it. And once fluent, it begins to do something almost unbelievable. It starts to recreate the conditions of the original absence, even when the original absence is gone. Even when you are surrounded by people who are genuinely available. Even when someone is standing right in front of you, arms open, asking to be let in. Here is how to understand this. Imagine you are watching a video of an underwater scene. Crystal clear water, soft coral, beautiful. Completely peaceful. But the soundtrack underneath it is something dark. Low, slow, minor chords. The music that, in every film you've ever watched, means something terrible is about to happen. Where does your body go? Your body braces. Your breath shortens slightly. Your shoulders come in just a fraction. Not because of anything you can see, but because the music is telling a story that your nervous system believes. That is exactly what happens inside you when someone in the present tries to get close. The present moment is safe. The person is real and available and genuinely wants to know you. But your nervous system is not listening to the present. It is playing a recording from a room you haven't physically lived in for decades. And it is playing it loud. And your body, faithful and ancient and trying to protect you, responds to the recording. This is why you can logically know someone loves you and still feel completely alone with them. This is why you can be surrounded by warmth and still feel the cold. This is why you can have everything you were supposed to want and still feel that hollow ache underneath it all. You are not imagining it. You are not being irrational. You are not broken. You are responding to a soundtrack that is older than the relationship you're standing in, older than the person in front of you, older than anything in your current life. And now I have to tell you something I am not going to soften, because you have been soft-pedaling this for too long yourself. That soundtrack is costing you enormously. It is costing you the experience of being truly known by another person. Not just liked. Not just respected. Known. The way you feel when someone sees all of it and stays anyway. Most people who carry this particular wiring never fully experience that. Not because it isn't available to them, but because every time it begins to approach, the old music starts, and something in them moves away. It is costing you the ability to ask for help when you actually need it. And I don't mean help with logistics or tasks. I mean the kind of help that requires you to say, out loud, to another person, "I am not okay right now and I need you." That sentence, for people who are emotionally alone as children, can feel almost physically impossible. And so they don't say it. They hold it. And holding it, year after year, has a weight that accumulates in the body in ways that eventually cannot be ignored. It is costing you your own emotional reality. Because the first environment you lived in told you, not in words but in the language of non-response, that your inner experience was not worth engaging with. And some part of you absorbed that verdict. Some part of you still checks, still hedges, still asks, am I being too much? Is this real? Am I making this up? It is real. It was always real. The fact that it wasn't reflected back to you is not evidence that you were wrong. It is evidence that the person who was supposed to reflect it back was missing something they needed in order to show up. And here, right here, is the pivot that everything else in this video is pointing toward. What do you actually do with all of this? Because I want to be honest with you about something. The answer is not a list. It is not 5 steps or a morning routine or a journaling practice, though none of those things are useless. Those interventions work at the level of behavior. And what we are talking about is not a behavioral problem. It is a story problem. It is a meaning problem. And meaning is changed not by doing differently, but by understanding differently. The first and most foundational shift is this. Move from asking, "What is wrong with me?" to asking, "What happened to me?" Those two questions sound almost identical. They lead to entirely different lives. What is wrong with me? Is a question that accepts the verdict. It places the problem inside your character, inside your worth, inside something essential and unchangeable about who you are. Every time you've said, "I'm just not good at letting people in," or "I'm not really a relationship person," or "I just need a lot of alone time," you have been answering the first question. And the first question has no good answer, because the premise is false. What happened to me? Is a clinical question, a curious question, a compassionate one. It places the origin exactly where it belongs, in the specific conditions of a specific environment in a specific time, not in the core of who you are. It separates you from the adaptation. And that separation, however small it feels the first time you make it, is the beginning of everything. The second shift is learning to hear your own soundtrack. Learning to recognize the old music when it starts playing. Because once you can name it, once you can pause in a moment of connection or vulnerability and think, there's the old recording, something changes. A gap opens. A tiny, crucial gap between the trigger and the response. Between the music and what you do next. You won't always be able to override it. Some days the music will be louder than your ability to name it. That is not failure. That is how deeply these things are written. But naming it, even once, even imperfectly, begins to reduce its authority over you. The third shift is building what researchers call a coherent narrative. And this is the one that takes the longest, but does the deepest work. A coherent narrative is not a story that explains everything or excuses everyone. It is a story that connects. A story where the pieces fit, where the cause and effect make sense, where you can hold your own history with something that feels more like understanding than shame. It means being able to say, "This is what happened in that room. This is what a child in that situation would have needed. This is what they built instead. This is what that building cost. And this is what I carry forward because of all of it." When you can hold all of that at once, without collapsing into self-blame and without bypassing into, "It wasn't that bad," something structural changes in how you hold yourself. You stop being the main character in a story about defectiveness, and you become the main character in a story about survival and adaptation and the very long, very real work of becoming whole. And the final shift is the one I want to leave you with, because it is the most quietly radical thing I know how to say. Reaching out is not weakness. It is not vulnerability in the soft, comfortable way that word gets used. For people with your particular history, reaching out is an act of neurological rebellion. Think about what it actually requires. Your oldest, deepest, most reinforced instruction set says, go it alone? Handle it yourself. Needing is dangerous. Transmitting on the frequency of "I need you" has historically returned nothing, and that nothing was more painful than the silence you could have chosen. Your brain learned this. Your body learned this. Every cell that was shaped by that early environment is still, on some level, operating by this instruction. To reach out anyway, to say, "I am struggling and I need someone." To let someone into the territory that you have managed alone for so long is not just a social act. It is a rewriting of the deepest code you are running on. It goes against the architecture. It contradicts the oldest adaptation your brain made. And it tells a new story to your own nervous system. A story that says, "We are somewhere different now. The room has changed. We are allowed to need. We come back now to where we started." That dinner table. The clinking glasses. The laughter you were inside of and somehow separate from at the same time. That feeling is not a flaw. It is not evidence of something wrong with your wiring. It is your nervous system's faithful, precise, dutiful memory of a child who sat in a room with enormous feelings and waited for someone to come. And in the absence of anyone coming, that child did the only available thing. They became their own company. They learned to carry the whole weight of their interior life alone, and they carried it so well and for so long that the carrying became invisible, even to themselves. And they carried it all the way here. To this moment. To you, watching this, perhaps recognizing yourself for the first time in something you've never had words for. The adult you are right now is the most capable, most resourced, most equipped version of that child who has ever existed. And the one thing that child never received, the one thing that only you can now provide, is the voice that says, "I see you." What you're feeling is real. And you are not alone in it anymore. When you offer that to yourself, even once, even quietly, even imperfectly, you are not just healing. You are finally giving the child in that room the only thing they ever actually needed. You are coming home. If something in this video reached something in you, I want you to tell me what it was. Not because I need the engagement, but because saying it out loud, even in a comment, even to strangers, is its own small act of reaching. And you could use the practice. What does this particular loneliness feel like for you? When does it tend to arrive? Leave it below. This community is thoughtful and it is safe, and your words matter here more than you might expect. And if this is the kind of conversation you want to keep having, subscribe to The Mind. We make these videos for the people who are willing to ask the harder questions. The ones that don't have easy answers, but have true ones. Take care of yourself. And I'll see you in the next one.